The courtroom was small and old. Brown wooden benches, buzzing fluorescent lights, the kind of county courthouse nobody updates because nothing important is supposed to happen there. The American flag in the corner had faded at the edges. The carpet near the gallery had worn thin from years of shuffling feet. A water stain on the ceiling above the witness stand had darkened over what looked like decades of slow seepage, and nobody had seen fit to repair it. There was something deliberately humble about the space, as though the building itself had been designed to discourage ambition. Small county, small proceedings, small stakes. That was exactly what my brother had counted on. He'd spent 3 weeks selecting this venue. I found out later from a paralegal who felt guilty enough to mention it when the whole thing was over. He had actually researched judges in 4 different counties, comparing their records in civil inheritance disputes, looking for someone older, someone unlikely to be impressed by credentials he didn't expect me to have. He found this courtroom. He found this judge. He built his case around the assumption that the woman sitting across the aisle from him was exactly what she appeared to be. A 63-year-old widow in a secondhand coat with no legal representation and nowhere near enough fight left. He had done his homework. He just hadn't done all of it. I had been sitting at the defense table alone for 40 minutes before the hearing began. I arrived early deliberately. I wanted to feel the room before it filled. I wanted to understand the sightlines, the acoustics, the particular quality of the afternoon light through the windows. 30 years in naval intelligence teaches you that environments matter before anything else happens inside them. You walk the space first. You let it speak before you do. The table smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. The chair wobbled slightly on the left rear leg. I pressed my foot against the floor and held it steady. Then I opened my leather folder, arranged my 3 manila envelopes in a specific order, and waited. My father arrived with Daniel at 8:47. I watched them come through the side door without turning my head. Peripheral vision becomes second nature after enough years of paying attention to things you aren't supposed to be openly watching. Daniel came in first, moving with the comfortable stride of a man who believed he'd already won. He wore a good suit, navy blue, recently pressed. He'd had his hair cut in the past few days. He looked in every possible way like a man whose victory was a formality. He shook hands with his attorney near the gallery rail and laughed at something that wasn't audible from where I sat. My father came in behind him slower. He walked with a cane now, something I hadn't seen the last time I'd tried to visit. His left hand rested on Daniel's arm for a moment as he navigated the step down to the gallery row. He looked 86. He looked every year of it. He settled into the bench behind Daniel's table, set his cane across his knees, and folded his hands. He didn't look at me. Not once in those 40 minutes before the hearing started did my father look at me. That told me everything I needed to know about what Daniel had been saying to him. The gallery held perhaps 20 people, a few local observers, a clerk, a woman near the back who appeared to be writing something and might have been a reporter from the county paper, though I couldn't be certain. 2 older men who looked like they'd simply wandered in from the parking lot for the warmth. Nobody there for me. I told the 3 people in my life who knew about the lawsuit to stay home. This wasn't something I wanted an audience for. Whatever happened in this room today was going to be difficult enough without the added weight of being watched by people who cared about the outcome. The judge entered at 8:59. He was perhaps 70, silver-haired, with the deliberate economy of movement that distinguishes people who have spent decades maintaining authority without needing to perform it. He sat. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the plaintiff's table, then at mine. That was when he asked about an attorney. And that was when my brother laughed. My brother and I grew up in a house on the edge of a small town in Virginia. The kind of town that has 1 stoplight and 2 churches and a diner that has served the same breakfast menu since 1962. Our father worked at the Regional Water Authority for 31 years. Our mother worked the early shift at that diner for 12 of those years before she got the job at the school district's administrative office, which was considered a significant upgrade by everyone who knew her. We were not poor by the standards of that town. We were not comfortable by the standards anywhere else. But we had a yard and a dog and a father who came home every night for dinner, and in the world my parents inhabited, that counted as abundance. Dad was a Korean War veteran. Not a man who talked about it. He was of a generation that didn't, but a man who had been shaped by it in ways that showed up sideways, in the way he expected silence at the dinner table, in the way he believed that problems were solved by working harder and complaining less, in the way he responded to weakness in other people with impatience so barely concealed, it functioned as contempt. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cold, he simply believed that the world was a place that rewarded endurance and punished softness, and he raised his children accordingly. He had very specific ideas about what a son was supposed to become and what a daughter was supposed to do. A son built things. A son worked with his hands or ran a business or served in some visible, socially legible way. A son stayed local, married local, put down roots the way men from my father's generation understood roots to mean not emotional depth, but physical permanence. You were where you were. You showed up. You stayed. A daughter stayed close, married well, and didn't ask questions about things outside her business. I was never going to be that daughter. I knew it by the time I was 14, though I didn't have language for it yet. What I had was a feeling that the town was too small, and the expectations were too narrow, and that somewhere beyond the county line, there were things I hadn't imagined yet that I was supposed to find. It wasn't ambition exactly. It was more like pressure, like something pushing outward from inside my chest that had no outlet in the geography my parents had given me. Daniel had no such pressure. He was happier by nature, or perhaps just more easily satisfied, which isn't the same thing but can look identical from the outside. He liked the town, liked knowing everyone's name and being known in return, liked the way a small community functions like a large family. He had friends from childhood he'd kept his entire life. He coached a youth baseball team for 11 years. He was, by almost any conventional measure, a successful participant in the social architecture of that place. Our parents adored him for it, not cruelly, not consciously, but the way parents sometimes love a child who confirms their values more than a child who challenges them. When Daniel was home, the house felt settled. When I was home, it felt like a conversation nobody quite knew how to finish. My father would ask me what I was doing, and I would try to explain it, and he would listen in a way that made it clear he couldn't quite believe what I was telling him. Not that he thought I was lying. He simply couldn't map it onto anything in his experience, so he set it aside and asked if I wanted more potatoes. I enlisted in the United States Navy on a Thursday in March 1979. I was 22 years old. I remember the drive to the recruiter's office, the way the bare trees looked against the gray sky that morning, the smell of burnt coffee in the waiting room while a petty officer explained what I was signing. I remember walking back to my car afterward and sitting behind the steering wheel for a few minutes without starting the engine, not from second thoughts, from the weight of it. The understanding that this was the moment when the life I had been living and the life I was going to live stopped being the same thing. I called my mother from a payphone outside a gas station. She cried a little, but told me she was proud. I called my father from the same payphone. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, I suppose you know what you're doing." It was the closest thing to a blessing I was going to get from him, and I understood that, and I took it, and I drove home. Daniel was 19 at the time. He said nothing about it for 3 days, and then one morning over breakfast, he looked at me across the table and said, "You're really going to leave?" He didn't say it as an accusation. He said it the way someone says a thing they've been sitting with long enough that it finally needs to come out of their mouth. "Yes," I said. He nodded, and something in his expression shifted in a way I didn't have words for then, and can barely describe now. Not anger, not grief, something quieter and more durable. The beginning of a long resentment that would calcify over the next 4 decades into something that eventually ended up in a county courthouse. I left for basic training 6 weeks later. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away. I knew if I looked back, I might not leave. I never really came back. Not the way they'd hoped, not the way that would have made sense to them. I spent 30 years doing work I was not allowed to describe. That sentence sounds more dramatic than the reality of it. The reality was paperwork, mostly. Long days in secure facilities reviewing documentation that looked to anyone who glanced at it from a distance like the most tedious bureaucratic material imaginable. Procurement forms, contractor background submissions, security clearance applications that ran 40, 60, sometimes 100 pages with supporting documentation attached, personnel files, financial disclosure statements, letters of recommendation from people whose own backgrounds had to be separately verified, audit trails through financial records that wound through multiple contractors and subcontractors and third-party vendors before you could begin to see the shape of what was actually happening underneath. The job, stripped to its bones, was this: decide who could be trusted with national security information and who couldn't, and then build a paper record solid enough to survive any legal or administrative challenge that came later. Most of what made someone untrustworthy wasn't dramatic. It wasn't ideology or criminal background or overt dishonesty. Most often it was much simpler. Debt, unexplained financial shifts, small inconsistencies between a person's stated history and what records actually showed, the gap between what someone said their life looked like and what it actually looked like when you pulled the thread. People are mostly consistent liars. Their patterns give them away if you know where to look. I learned to look early. Within 2 years of entering the field, I had developed a specific kind of attention that I still carry with me now, years after retirement. It's not suspicious attention. It's more like the attention of someone who reads the same kind of stories so often that the structure becomes visible. You start to see the shape of a deception before you can identify what exactly is being concealed, the way certain details are offered too readily, the way other details are never mentioned voluntarily, the way financial records never quite add up to the narrative being presented, even when the discrepancy is small. Small discrepancies, in my experience, are almost always the beginning of larger ones. I worked Gulf War contractor audits from 1990 through 1992. That period was one of the most intensive of my career. The volume of procurement moving through military supply channels during that buildup was enormous, and the pressure to process contractors quickly created conditions where corners got cut and oversight got thin. I worked 18-hour days during stretches of that period. I lost 12 pounds. I developed a coffee habit I've never fully recovered from. 3 contractors whose files I flagged were eventually prosecuted for procurement fraud. 2 more had their clearances revoked without prosecution. The dollar amounts involved ran into the tens of millions. My father, during that period, called me twice. Once to ask if I was coming home for Thanksgiving. Once to ask if I could look into getting Daniel a government job because he'd heard they had good benefits. I missed that Thanksgiving. I found Daniel a pamphlet about civil service exam preparation and mailed it to the house. Nobody mentioned it again. Frank, my husband, who I met in Norfolk in 1987, understood the work better than anyone. He'd been Coast Guard before transitioning to harbor inspection, so he had a working knowledge of the way government service functions and the particular kind of patience it requires. He never asked me to explain things I couldn't explain. He never took my absences personally, or if he did, he understood them well enough not to let it corrode what we were building together. We were married for 22 years before pancreatic cancer took him in 2017. He was 61. He should have had 20 more years. After Frank died, I worked another year, completed my final contract, and retired in 2018. I was 63 years old. I had a house on the Chesapeake Bay that Frank and I had bought in 2003, the kind of house we'd told each other we'd earn someday and eventually actually did. I had a pension. I had decades of experience nobody in my immediate family family knew anything about. And I had, for the first time in my adult life, nothing demanding my attention on any particular morning. I went home to Virginia, not to the town where I grew up, that chapter was long finished, but to the house on the bay. I grew a garden. I took long walks along the water in the mornings. I read books I'd been accumulating on a list for years. I learned to make my mother's recipe for biscuits, which I'd watched her make 100 times, but never attempted myself. I thought that was what the rest of my life would look like. I was wrong. My mother started calling me late at night about 2 years before she died. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough that I started keeping my phone on the nightstand with the volume up, which I hadn't done in years. The calls came between 10 and midnight usually, after my father had gone to bed. That timing was never accidental. My mother was not a careless woman. Everything she did had a reason, even when the reason was something she couldn't say directly. She was 78 when the calls started. She'd been in good health for most of her life. Strong woman, the kind who never sat down before the work was done and rarely sat down after it either. But the previous winter, she'd had a small cardiac episode that her doctors classified as mild, but that had frightened her in a way she didn't talk about with people who weren't paying close attention. I was paying close attention. The episode had stolen something from her. Not physical capacity exactly, something harder to name. A certain confidence in the solidity of things. The sense that the world would continue operating according to the rules she'd understood for 7 decades. Daniel had begun spending more time at the house by then. Initially, it seemed natural. He lived 20 minutes away. He had a flexible schedule. His business ventures had always given him irregular hours, even when they weren't generating irregular income. And my parents were aging in ways that required more practical assistance. Driving to appointments, managing medications, handling the particular administrative tasks that multiply around elderly people the way they multiply around no one else. Insurance paperwork, Medicare questions, the endless bureaucratic maintenance of simply being old in America. My father's arthritis made some of this difficult. My mother's schedule of part-time volunteering at the church left less time for it. Daniel stepped in. It was on its face a generous thing. What I noticed, slowly, was that the calls from my mother became more careful. Not warmer or colder, just more careful. Careful in the specific way of someone choosing their words with more precision than usual, because they're aware that precision matters. She would call and we would talk about ordinary things, the garden, the church social, a movie she'd watched on television, and then, in what felt like a conversational aside but never actually was, she would mention something that required me to pay close attention. "Daniel's handling the finances now," she said once, very casually. "He set up something on the computer so the bills get paid automatically. Very convenient." I said that sounded helpful. "He gets upset when I ask him to explain things," she said, and then immediately changed the subject to something about a neighbor's new car. That sentence I held in my mind for a long time. Another night, she asked me if I thought $4,200 was a reasonable monthly expense for household upkeep. I asked what that included. She wasn't sure exactly. That was what she said. "I'm not sure exactly." My mother had kept a household budget by hand in a small green ledger since 1964. She knew exactly what everything cost. She had always known exactly what everything cost. "I'm not sure exactly" was not a sentence my mother said about money. Another call. She'd found a letter from an insurance company she didn't recognize addressed to my father regarding something about a policy modification. She'd asked Daniel about it and he'd said he'd handle it, and the letter had disappeared and she hadn't seen it again. She said this in the same tone she'd used to mention that the mail had been late that week, but she mentioned it to me, not to a neighbor, not to her sister, not to anyone else. She mentioned it to me specifically at 11:15 at night, after my father was asleep. She was filing a report. That was what I understood after a while. She couldn't address the situation directly, for reasons I was beginning to understand, but she was building a record with the only person she trusted to know what to do with it. She was doing, in her own way, what I had spent 30 years doing professionally, creating documentation that could survive whatever came later. The last Thanksgiving before she died, I drove up to spend 3 days. The house looked the same from the outside. Inside, things had shifted in ways I could feel, but not immediately name. My father seemed smaller in his chair somehow. The kitchen was organized differently than I remembered. Small changes, the kind that accumulate silently over months until you notice them all at once. Daniel was there for dinner. He dominated the conversation in the way of someone accustomed to being the central figure in a room. He talked about a business opportunity, work on his house, people I didn't know, charming and loud enough to fill the space my parents' quieter energy had left. My father laughed at his jokes. My mother passed the food and watched me across the table. After dinner, in the kitchen, as I helped her wash the dishes, she reached across and put her hand on my arm for a moment. Not a dramatic gesture, not even a long one. She squeezed my forearm gently, the way you touch someone when you want to say something you don't have the words for, or don't have the privacy to say, or have decided to say in some other way. I looked at her. She looked back at me. Her eyes were calm, decided, like someone who has finished a very long internal argument and arrived at a conclusion they know is right, even if the path that led there was difficult. Then she said, "More green beans?" and turned back to the dishes. I drove home the next morning and started making a list of what I needed to know. The call came on a Tuesday night in October, about 14 months before she died. I remember the time because I'd been sitting on the porch with a glass of wine watching the last light come off the bay, which I do every clear evening when the weather allows. The phone rang at 10:43. I saw her number on the screen and picked up immediately. Her voice was quieter than usual. She didn't begin the way she normally did, with some small observation about the day. She said my name, and then she said, "I found a letter from the county about the property taxes." I sat up straighter. The bay was very still that night. A heron stood at the water's edge edge 30 yards off, absolutely motionless. What does the letter say? I asked. She read it to me. A delinquency notice for the previous 18 months, 2 separate missed payment periods, a total outstanding amount plus penalties. The letter used the language those letters use, the dry bureaucratic language of institutions that deal in consequences without apology. It mentioned the possibility of a lien filing if the matter wasn't resolved within 60 days. Did you know about this? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Daniel said taxes would be handled through the account he set up. Did he show you statements from that account? No. Did you ask? She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The sound of a woman who has spent 8 decades being careful not to make situations worse by asking questions at the wrong time, and who has recently begun to wonder whether that instinct was wisdom or cowardice. Go to bed, I told her. I'll handle it. I was in my car at 6 the next morning. 2 hours to Fairfax, to the county records office, which opened at 8:30. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before they unlocked the doors, drinking gas station coffee out of a paper cup, making a list of what I needed. What the records showed when I finally had access to them was straightforward and ugly. 18 months of property tax payments had not been made on the family home, not missed accidentally, not paid to the wrong account, not lost in a processing error. Simply not made, while, based on the bank statements my mother had given me access to after the call, money continued to move through the household account in regular intervals. The money had moved somewhere, just not to the county tax office. I did not call Daniel, I did not call my father. I did not mention what I'd found to anyone except my accountant, who helped me make a wire transfer of $16,240 from my own savings account to the county, which cleared the delinquency, prevented the lien filing, and established a payment record that would later become relevant in a very different context. Then I drove home and made more notes. I had been a government investigator for 3 decades. I knew what a pattern looked like. I knew the difference between a single unexplained anomaly and the visible edge of something much larger. The tax situation was not the first anomaly. It was the one with a government document attached to it, but it was not the first. What I had was a pattern. What I didn't have yet was documentation of the center of it. That was the next problem to solve. The tax records were the edge of something. I spent the next 6 months finding out what. It was not easy work. I was operating without authority, without institutional access, without the tools I'd spent a career learning to use. What I had was retirement and a particular kind of patience. I made phone calls. I visited the county recorder's office 3 more times. I wrote letters requesting copies of public documents, which required waiting and follow-up requests, and twice gentle written reminders that I was entitled to the records I was asking for under state disclosure law. What I assembled, slowly and carefully, was a picture of my brother's financial activities over the previous 4 years. Not complete, not every transaction, but enough of a shape to understand what I was looking at. The refinancing documents were the most significant piece. In the 18 months before my mother entered hospice, while her health was failing and her ability to monitor financial details was diminishing week by week, my brother had opened a line of credit against a portion of the family property. The paperwork listed my mother as the borrowing party. Her signature appeared on 3 separate documents. The proceeds, approximately $240,000 across multiple draws, had moved through an account I couldn't directly access, but from which I could trace transfers to a business entity registered in my brother's name. The business entity had dissolved 14 months after the last draw, with, as far as I could determine from public records, no significant assets remaining. $240,000 had passed through a failing business venture, drawn against my parents' home, secured with my mother's signature during a period when she'd been calling me in the middle of the night to ask if property taxes could increase by unexplained amounts. My mother had signed those documents. I held that fact carefully, turned it over, looked at it from different angles, the way you hold a piece of evidence you're still deciding what to do with. She had signed them. Whether she'd understood what she was signing, whether she'd been clearly informed of the terms, whether she'd been in a condition to make that decision coherently, those were questions I could not answer alone. They were questions that would require other people, other expertise, other processes. What I knew was this: the same brother who was now suing me for financially manipulating a vulnerable elderly woman had, by my accounting, extracted $250,000 from that same woman's property in the 2 years prior. He had done it quietly. He had left a paper trail only because paper trails are unavoidable, and he was counting on the fact that nobody would think to look. I was looking. I copied everything. I organized it chronologically. I built a file the way I'd built files for 30 years. Complete, annotated, cross-referenced, sourced. I kept it in a locked box in the bedroom closet that Frank had installed years ago for sensitive work documents, and that I'd kept even after retirement, because old habits survive the occasions that created them. Then I waited to see what my brother would do next. I didn't have to wait long. My mother died on a Wednesday in April. She was in the hospital for 11 days before the end. Pneumonia, which her weakened heart couldn't fight effectively. And she died quietly, early in the morning, with my father holding her hand and Daniel in the chair by the window and me standing near the door. She looked very small in the hospital bed. She'd been a tall woman most of her life. Illness compresses people. I cried on the drive home, on an empty county road with farmland on both sides and the sun just coming up over the tree line. I pulled off at a farm stand that was closed and parked for a while. Not long. Then I drove the rest of the way home. 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel filed the lawsuit. The filing alleged that I had, in the final year of my mother's life, used my access to her and my distance from the daily family situation to influence her in altering a prior version of her will. It alleged that she had not been mentally competent to make the changes she made, and that the changes would not not have occurred without sustained pressure from me. It sought the invalidation of the final will and a reversion to the prior version. It sought legal fees. It named me as the sole defendant. I sat with the papers at my kitchen table for 3 hours. Outside, the bay was gray-green in the afternoon light, and a boat was moving slowly across the middle distance, too far away to identify. I read the filing twice, then a third time, then set it down and looked at the water for a long time. Then I went to the locked box in the bedroom closet and opened it. 3 weeks after I received the lawsuit, a letter arrived. Certified mail, which required my signature at the door. The envelope was addressed in my mother's handwriting. Uneven, the letters slightly larger than she'd used in younger years, but unmistakably hers. There was no return address. The postmark was dated from a town 40 miles from where she lived, which I assumed meant she'd asked someone to mail it for her. Inside was a single sheet of her stationery. Pale blue flowers around the border, the same she'd used for Christmas cards and birthday notes since before I could remember. One sentence in the center of the page: "If you need to fight them, bring proof." I folded the letter along its original crease and put it back in the envelope. I added it to the box in the closet. I noted the certification number and the postmark date. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and began planning in earnest. The pretrial documents arrived in a thick manila envelope about 3 weeks after Daniel filed. His attorney's firm was based in the county seat, a 4-attorney operation that handled mostly real estate transactions and estate work. The lead attorney on the filing was listed as Raymond Galt, Georgetown Law, admitted to the state bar in 1997. I sat with that name for a long time. There was a quality to the recognition, the specific low-frequency hum of a detail that means something you can't immediately place, that I'd learned to treat with respect over the course of 30 years. Not every recognition turned into something. Some were coincidences, some were pattern-seeking in the absence of actual patterns, which is a hazard of spending too long looking for signals in noise. But the ones that had that particular quality, the ones that sat in the back of the mind with a kind of patient weight, those almost always turned into something. I went home that evening and opened the storage cabinet in the second bedroom. I keep physical copies of significant work documents going back to 1988. Not classified materials, those were properly disposed of at retirement, but reference files, procedural records, contractor audit reports, clearance process documentation. The kinds of records that don't have classification markings, but that a career's worth of instinct tells you to keep. It took me 40 minutes to find the right year, 1994. The Gulf War contractor audit files. I went through them slowly, reading index pages first, then pulling specific folders. The fluorescent light in that room buzzed slightly, a sound I'd been meaning to have the fixture replaced for 2 years and kept forgetting about. Raymond Galt, defense contractor clearance application. Secondary review flag from prior employer. Re-reviewed and conditionally approved February 14th, 1994. Approving officer, my signature. I sat at the small desk in that room for a long time without moving. He would remember the approval. People whose clearances are flagged and conditionally approved remember the process. They remember who handled their case, the conditions attached, the 2 follow-up compliance checks. He would know the moment I asked that question exactly who had signed his clearance and exactly what I had access to. Every annotated concern, every detail his prior employer had flagged, the complete documented picture of a young attorney at the beginning of his career. I closed the folder. I returned it to the cabinet. I turned off the buzzing light. I didn't mention what I'd found to anyone, not to the one friend I'd told about the lawsuit, not to my accountant, not to anyone. I simply added it to my understanding of the situation and kept preparing. I drove to the courthouse alone. I'd been offered company. The one friend who knew about the lawsuit had called the night before and asked if I wanted her to sit in the gallery. I told her no. I told her I'd call when it was over. She said she'd keep her phone on, and I thanked her, and I drove the 2 hours in the early morning quiet with the radio off and the windows cracked an inch because I've always thought better with a small amount of cold air moving through a car. I arrived 45 minutes before the hearing. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars belonging to courthouse staff, a truck with a county seal on the door. I sat in my own car for a few minutes and went through what I'd prepared one more time. Not reviewing it exactly. I knew the documents. I knew the timeline. I knew every number in every folder. I was doing what I'd always done before an important proceeding, letting the preparations settle into stillness so that when the moment came, I wouldn't be thinking about what I knew. I would simply know it. I took my leather folder and my 3 manila envelopes and walked in through the main entrance. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish and faintly someone's coffee from earlier in the morning. I found the defense table. I set my folder down. I arranged the 3 envelopes in the order I intended to use them. I took off my coat, folded it neatly across the chair beside me, and sat down. Then I waited. My brother arrived with his attorney at 8:47. I watched them in my peripheral vision. Daniel was well-dressed, confident, talking easily with Galt as they came through the door. He glanced at me once briefly and smiled in a way that wasn't warm. Then he looked away and continued his conversation with his attorney, as though the room was already his. My father came in behind them, moving slowly with his cane. He didn't look at me either. Not once in the 40 minutes before the judge entered did my father look in my direction. The judge entered at 8:59. He settled himself behind the bench, arranged his papers, adjusted his glasses, and looked first at the plaintiff's table and then at mine. "No attorney?" he asked. My brother laughed. The sound was easy, relaxed, the laugh of a man sharing a private joke with himself in a public room. "She can't afford one," he said, and the warmth in his voice was almost impressive. It managed to sound like concern. My father nodded beside him, slowly, proudly. I didn't say a word. I looked at the documents in front of me for one moment, not reviewing them, just acknowledging that that they were there. And then I took off my coat, folded it across the chair beside me exactly as I had folded it when I arrived, and stood. 30 years of work teach you certain things about how to enter a room. They teach you how to stand. They teach you where to put your hands and how to hold your shoulders, and how to make the simple act of standing at a table communicate that you are not someone to be efficiently dismissed. I'd spent my career in rooms where the question of who held authority was usually settled before anyone spoke, by how you moved, by whether you needed the room's permission to occupy it. I didn't need anyone's permission. I looked at Raymond Galt. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed, with the practiced ease of a man who had been comfortable in courtrooms for 30 years. He had his legal pad open and his pen ready, and the small, professionally neutral expression of someone who considers the proceeding a formality. I asked my question. Who signed your security clearance? 3 seconds of silence, then 5. The pen in his hand stopped moving. The neutral expression dissolved into something underneath it that wasn't neutral at all, something that was closer to recognition, and below that, something that was closer to dread. The color left his face from the top down, which is how it happens when the body is making decisions faster than the mind can explain. He was trying to place me. He'd been trying since the pre-trial documents and hadn't connected it, and now he was connecting it, standing in a small county courtroom at 9 in the morning with his client's case half opened on the table, and the connection was not a comfortable one. My brother didn't understand. He looked at Galt, then at me, then back at Galt, waiting for someone to explain. Nobody explained. The courtroom, which had been carrying the ordinary low hum of proceedings underway, had gone completely still. The judge said, "Mr. Galt." Galt set down his pen. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "I'd like to request a brief recess." The judge granted 5 minutes. The gallery stirred briefly and then settled. Galt and my brother moved to the back of the room and spoke in low voices near the window. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. I could see the conversation in Galt's posture, the careful way he was managing his client, the way a professional manages the sudden discovery that the case he'd been handed is not the case he thought it was. My brother was irritated. He made a gesture with his hand that communicated impatience, then said something sharp, and Galt responded quietly and at length, and my brother gradually stopped gesturing and stood still and listened. I stayed seated at the defense table and looked at my 3 envelopes. Outside the courtroom windows, the November sky was the particular flat gray that settles over that part of Virginia in late autumn, the sky of a season that has finished announcing itself and simply arrived. My father sat in the gallery behind Daniel's table. His cane lay across his knees. His hands were folded on top of it. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at the back of Daniel's head where Daniel stood whispering with his attorney. He didn't look at me, but I watched him in my peripheral vision the way I had watched things for 30 years without appearing to watch them, and I saw what was happening in his face. Not understanding, something earlier than understanding. The first crease of it. The beginning of the realization that the room he'd walked into this morning and the room he was currently sitting in were not quite the same room. The judge returned. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. I placed the first envelope on the table in front of me and opened it. The first folder held the property tax records. I didn't narrate them theatrically. I'd learned long ago that documentation doesn't need performance. It needs presentation. I laid the relevant pages across the table in chronological order, identified them for the court record by date and issuing authority, and stated what they showed. 18 months of delinquency on the family property. Lien filing notices. 2 separate written warnings from the county. A total outstanding amount of $16,240. I then presented the wire transfer record from my own account, showing that amount paid to the county in full, dated 11 months before my mother's death. My father shifted in the gallery behind Daniel's table. He said something I couldn't quite hear, just a few words, directed at no one in particular. Daniel turned halfway in his chair and said something brief and sharp in a low voice. My father fell quiet. The judge asked whether the family had been aware of the delinquency. I said my mother had been aware. I said I was unaware of evidence that my father or brother had been formally notified. Galt said nothing. Daniel said, "She's mischaracterizing the situation." His voice was tighter now, less performance in it. I opened the second folder. The refinancing documents were more complex, so I took more time. I walked through them in the order they were executed. I named the dates. I named the amounts. I noted that the documents carried my mother's signature and that the final draw against the line of credit occurred during the same hospitalization period she entered 7 weeks before her death. The judge put on his glasses and read the dates himself. He read them twice. Then he asked, without looking up, whether the prior will had named my brother as executor of the estate. Galt said yes. The judge nodded slowly and continued reading. Daniel's hands, folded on the table in front of him, had stopped looking relaxed. The second folder went into the court record. I closed it. I set it to my left. I looked at the third envelope for a moment. Then I opened it. The third envelope held my mother's letter. I placed it on the table and identified it for the record. A handwritten letter, certified mail, postmarked 7 weeks before my mother's death, signed in her hand, addressed to me at my home in Virginia. I stated the certification number. I stated the date received. I said that I was requesting it be entered into evidence as a statement of intent from the decedent. Galt objected on grounds of competency. The judge asked me to respond. I said that the same attorney who had just argued my mother lacked the mental competency to be influenced into changing a will had spent the prior 40 minutes defending the legitimacy of refinancing documents she'd signed during an even later period of declining health. I said the question of her competency could not be answered differently for documents that helped my brother's case than for documents that helped mine. The judge sustained my position. My father made a sound, not a word, something lower than a word, something that came from a place below language. He had recognized the envelope. He was staring at it the way a person stares at something they know belongs to the past and cannot account for in the present. Is that hers? Yes, he said. His voice was just above a whisper. No one answered him directly. The bailiff carried the envelope to the judge. The judge opened it carefully. He removed the single folded sheet. He read it in approximately 15 seconds. Then he read it again. If you need to fight them, bring proof. My father lowered his head. His hands tightened on his cane. His shoulders moved once, sharply, the way shoulders move when something hits a person in the chest unexpectedly. She wrote that to you? He said. I looked at my father. Not unkindly. He was 86 years old. He'd spent the last year being told a story, and he'd believed it, not from malice, but from the particular vulnerability of a man who'd lost his wife and transferred his trust to the nearest available person. That was ordinary. That was human. That didn't make it less painful to witness. She did, I said quietly. The judge set the letter down carefully on the bench in front of him, like a man placing a fragile and important object in a safe location. He said nothing for a moment. In the gallery, no one moved. Outside the windows, the gray November sky was entirely still. Daniel stared at the letter from across the room. From where I sat, I could see his face very clearly. The performance was gone. The confidence was gone. What was left was something smaller and older, the expression of a man who has been building a thing for a very long time that has just come down. The judge looked at the room for a moment, then he looked at Daniel, then he looked at the second folder. He reached for it. I watched my brother. I want to be precise about what I observed, because I've spent a career understanding the difference between what I see and what I interpret, and I want to be accurate about this particular moment with this particular man. What I saw was not guilt, exactly. Not shame, exactly. What I saw was the end of a story Daniel had been telling himself for a very long time. The story in which he was the loyal son and I was the one who'd abandoned the family, in which his choices were compensations for my failures, in which taking what he took was something he'd earned by staying when I left. That story had just run out of room. He looked at me once. Just once, briefly, in the way a person looks at someone they've spent years resenting and have suddenly run out of the energy to resent. Not a softening, not forgiveness, something much simpler and much more deleted than either of those things. The judge opened the second folder. Galt stared at the table. My father bent his head and covered his eyes with one shaking hand. And for the first time in my life, in a small, cold, ordinary county courtroom, my brother had absolutely nothing left to say.